Hello and welcome to the 2023 K-State Garden Hour webinar series. We're so glad you're here today. This webinar series started in 2020 and has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. Since the start of the program, we've reached over 43,000 gardeners just like you. We're pleased to continue offering K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you have enjoyed the educational webinars though, or plan to continue joining us, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support this program. Your contribution helps us to put on this program and cover expenses such as the Zoom license. If you wish to support the K-State Garden Hour webinar series, a link to donate can be found in the chat or on the K-State Garden Hour website. We appreciate your continued support. This webinar is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Matthew McKernan, and I'm a horticulture agent for the K-State Research and Extension office in Sedgwick County. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional with K-State. Most of us have a background in horticultural education or a related discipline, and we all share a love of gardening and sharing that gardening passion with others. We're glad you are here joining us today to become better gardeners with us. Before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation today. This is where we will be looking for questions at the end of the webinar to be able to ask our speaker. So please use that Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Please click on that and enter your questions, and we'll be able to organize and sort your questions there. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the K-State Garden Hour website following the presentation. We typically upload additional resources related to today's presentation on our website as well. We will share the links in the chat so that you can find those, and those links will also be posted to our website after the presentation as well. Lastly, I'd like to introduce our moderating team today, who will be helping share information through the chat during the presentation. Our chat moderator today is Calla Edwards from Butler County, and Sharon Ashworth will be moderating our Q&A and helping us facilitate question and answer portion of our webinar with our speaker. Today's topic is going to be drought tolerant lawns of Kansas, focusing on warm season turf grasses. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ross Braun. Dr. Braun is the Assistant Professor of Turf Grass and Landscape Management at K-State, where he serves as a student professor, a turf grass researcher, and director of the Rocky Ford Turf Grass Research Center in Manhattan, Kansas. We're thrilled to have Dr. Braun with us today to share his turf grass expertise. Everyone, let's welcome Dr. Braun as we take a few moments to transition and let him share his presentation for the day.
Thank you, Matthew. Let me share my screen here. All right, my screen should be sharing, hopefully. All right, so we'll get started here. So today we're gonna be talking about drought tolerant lawns of Kansas, focusing on warm season turf grasses. Little background about myself: professor of turf grass and landscape management at K-State. I'm about a 50-50 split teaching and conducting research in turf grass science, and conduct a variety of different undergraduate courses at K-State related to turf grass management, irrigation management, and so on. I actually did my graduate school at K-State, both my master's and my PhD, so I lived in Kansas for over 5 years during that time. After graduate school, I moved over to Indiana and worked at Purdue University for over 4 years as a research scientist. And then thankfully, I've been back at K-State now for a little over a year. So it's great to be back in Kansas, and I'm really happy and looking forward to speaking today on drought tolerant lawns. It's a really key issue in the turf grass industry. So a little brief outline what we're going to be talking about today. We're looking at some differences between cool season and warm season turf grasses. After that, I'll be kind of diving more into what are these warm season options that we have for Kansas. And then to kind of finish it all up, looking at some best management practices. It's always a good to kind of touch back on these. What are the best management practices in turf, whether we're managing cool season or warm season grasses, and just kind of a quick refresher. And maybe some new knowledge for some of you, how to better manage your lawns and get the best quality of it, but at the same time, how can we be saving water and reducing other inputs such as fertilization or mowing. All right, so first let's look at differences between cool season and warm season turf grasses. And so for cool season, or we call them C3 turf grasses versus warm season C4 turf grasses, they get these names C3 or C4. It's all because of their photosynthetic cycle. So photosynthesis, just kind of a quick refresher here. I'm not going to get too much into plant physiology, but that photosynthesis is a very crucial and important process in all plants, where it's combining carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with sunlight and water, and it's turning that into energy through creating carbohydrates for the plant, for that plant to have energy to grow. And so it takes some energy to do this process, but also in turn, it's creating a lot of energy for the plant. And so when we come up with these names, cool season plants or warm season plants, in this case today, I'm talking about cool season grasses versus warm season grasses. So for our cool season ones, these are going to be like our Kentucky bluegrass, our bent grasses, ryegrasses, tall fescue, fine fescues, and there's many others. And so they get this name C3 because the first part of their photosynthetic pathway, they use a 3-carbon sugar molecule. And so that 3-carbon, 3C, that's where it's getting the name, and we call them C3 grasses. And then for our warm season grasses, we call these C4 grasses or C4 turf grasses or C4 plants. And they're using a 4-carbon molecule in their photosynthetic pathway. Long story short here is the warm season grasses, that C4 photosynthetic pathway, it's more efficient, especially as temperatures increase in the summertime. So as temperatures rise, those warm season plants aren't wasting as much energy during their photosynthetic process. And so they just do a lot better under heat stress and as temperatures increase. Whereas the cool season grasses, they have some multiple processes during that photosynthetic pathway, and they're not as efficient. So as temperatures increase, they lose some energy, they're losing some carbon molecules there, and they're not producing as much energy during that time. And so for our warm season C4 turf grasses, it's going to be Bermuda grass, Zoysia grass, buffalo grass, and there's many others, more tropical warm season grasses that we don't grow in Kansas because they're not cold tolerant enough, but we do have some that we can grow in Kansas and they can do really well. So if we look at this list here, here's our cool season C3 grasses, tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, and the list goes on there. You've probably seen some of these different species. A lot of these cool season grasses can be seeded. So you can buy grass seed in different stores and seed these. And then we have our warm season C4 grasses over here on the right side. And these would be like buffalo grass and Zoysia grass, as I mentioned, Bermuda grass. And the list goes on there, but really those bottom ones from centipede down, those are all warm season grasses that are more tropical. We'll find those more in the southern parts of the United States, in Texas, Louisiana, Florida, where their winters don't get as cold as we get here in Kansas. And so they would just die off over the wintertime because they don't have as good as cold tolerance as a buffalo grass or Bermuda grass or Zoysia grass. And so if we look at this map here, we kind of, in the turf industry, we split the turf grass industry up into kind of multiple different zones on where we classify them based on their climate, and then what grasses are grown in those regions. And so we have different, such as cool humid or cool arid, meaning more drier, and so on. And then you can see in the southern parts of the United States there with warmer regions or tropical regions. And really the key focus here is, Kansas is in this transitional humid, or what we call the transitional climatic zone, or in short, we call it just the transition zone. And that includes many other states there, as you can see, I've kind of highlighted in that box. And the thing with the transition zone is we get cold winters, obviously not as cold as the very northern regions of the United States, but we get warm summers that are a lot more extreme than the northern parts of the United States. And so we have this transition where we can grow these warm season grasses, but they might suffer a little bit in the wintertime. We can also grow the cool season grasses, but they're definitely going to suffer in our summertime when we're experiencing heat and drought stress, compared to the northern parts of the country like North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin that don't have those extreme temperatures of 90s for multiple days or weeks like we experience here in Kansas. And so this transitional climatic zone, the transition zone, really it's been labeled as the most difficult region to manage grasses, and that's been known for quite a while, multiple decades. And if any of you have gone through multiple summers and winters here in Kansas trying to grow grass in your lawn, depending on what you're trying to grow, it's either suffering in the summertime, or you might be getting some cold winter injury, some winter kill from a cold winter with a warm season grass. So it's really difficult depending on what kind of grass we're trying to manage. Whereas in comparison, if you were managing turf grasses in the southern parts of the United States, where you could just manage warm season grasses, kind of your fear of winter kill from cold injury isn't as much as compared to in the transition zone. So it makes a lot more sense just to grow warm season grass. Whereas the cool season grass really is not going to make it in the southern parts of the United States. and vice versa for the northern parts of the United States, with cool season grasses are more adapted to those northern regions. And so why is this the most difficult? Just as I mentioned there, it's cool enough in the winter that there's potential damage for warm season grasses, but it's not always the case. It really depends on year-to-year variability. And then it's warm enough in our summers, and that's pretty consistent summer to summer, that's going to make it very difficult to maintain a high quality cool season lawn. And so if we look at optimum air temperatures for both cool season and warm season turf grasses, we see if for the air temperatures, those cool season grasses, they really like it between about 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's going to be in the springtime and in the fall. For those cool season grasses, they're going to be growing more during those periods. It's more favorable for more photosynthesis during those periods for those cool season grasses. And then our warm season grasses, they're going to be slower to green up, and then they're going to have their optimum growth and for those air temperatures about 80 to 95 degrees that we see in the summertime throughout the summer months of June, July, August, even potentially into September some years. And that could even start in May as well. And then for optimum soil temperatures, which is in relation to the air temperatures, obviously those cool season grasses are going to do a lot better with a little bit cooler soil temperatures that you'd see in the spring and in the fall when soil temperatures are cooling back down towards winter. With our warm season grasses doing a lot better soil temperature with higher soil temperatures that you'd find in the summertime in Kansas. And so if we look at like these two figures here over on the right, on the top, we have cool season turf, and on the bottom, we have warm season turf. And so what does that kind of look like if we're looking at root and shoot growth over the calendar year? And so on the top, moving from left to right, from January through December through the months, and the same as on the bottom graph, January through December. So the top is for cool season grasses. You can see all for shoot growth, what you're actually visibly seeing on the surface for those plants. You're going to have the grass starting to green up in February or March, depending on the seasonal variability. Getting a lot of growth going on in April, May, starting to slow down in June, and really slowing down in July and August. And then we see a slight little peak of growth where we get a little more growth in the fall again, but not nearly as much as we see in the springtime. And then it's still maintaining some green color going into the wintertime. Whereas our warm season grasses, they're going to be slower to green up, and they might not green up until March, April, even early May some years. And then we get sustained growth over the summertime, June, July, and August. Things start to slow down in September with cooler temperatures arriving in the fall time. And then typically when we start to get that first hard frost, things really shut down and they'll start to lose color and go winter dormant and be that off color of a kind of a straw brown or golden brown throughout the wintertime until the soil temperatures warm back up in the next spring and they start all over again. So both of these are perennial turfgrass systems. They're coming back from the same plant, although they can also produce seed and produce more plants that way. But a lot of these they're all perennial. What we're talking about here is perennial turf grasses, cool season and warm season, coming back from their vegetative structures. And so just another way to look at that here, I've overlaid the cool season and warm season turf grasses, kind of their growth rates on top of one another. So you can see we have differences in different times of the year on when we're having kind of our most optimum growth occurring. And so that we start to think about, and I'll mention this later on in the presentation, when we're looking at fertilizing these grasses, we can't fertilize these grasses at the same time. It makes really no sense to be fertilizing cool season grasses in mid-June through August when growth is slowing down. You're actually going to probably be promoting more disease and other problems in your lawn if you have a cool season lawn. Whereas if you have a warm season lawn, it makes a lot more sense to be only fertilizing in the summertime when you're actually having growth occur between June through August during those months. And so just kind of going back here, so again, we have differences in optimum and soil temperatures for these cool season and warm season grasses, and this is all going to be related to as far as how do they survive heat and drought stress better during our extreme temperatures that we experience in the summertime here in Kansas. And so I just pulled some data from the internet of some different sites throughout Kansas. Here we have Manhattan, Kansas, in Kansas City, and then also Wichita. So kind of three different, parts of the state. And, we all know this, but we get those extreme temperatures and really consistent average highs above 80 to 85 or higher in the summertime during those months of June through August, even occurring in May and September in the southern parts of states in Wichita. And then the other thing to think about is, what about precipitation? Obviously, as the summer months go on in July and August, things get drier. And even though you look at the totals here for precipitation, and they might be some, anywhere 4 to 5 inches, it seems like, okay, you're getting a lot of rain. But if that rainfall is coming in a heavy rainfall event of a downpour, the plant can't take up all that water that fast. And so really a lot of it's wasted compared to a slow rainfall event. So sometimes looking at numbers like that, it's not really true to what's occurring. We know that we're getting drought stress occurring, even though we're getting heavy downfall, rain downpours. And so we look at something like this. This figure here is the normal annual precipitation based on a 30-year climate normals. And we all know there's this gradient when we move across the state of Kansas from west to east, right? We get less rainfall on the western side of the state. And as you can see, and as we move across the state from west to east, we get more rainfall occurring. And again, it's really dependent on, well, how much rainfall is occurring in one rainfall event. Is it a downpour or is it a slow gradual rainfall? More often than not, we get these heavy rainfall events. And so even though we have some higher numbers at times over on the eastern side of the state, we still experience periods of drought for a week or two or more in the summertime where we have had between rainfall events. So here's some research I conducted at K-State during my PhD. And in the summers of 2015 and 2016, I repeated in 2016, and I looked at through 4 different turfgrass species. So I looked at 2 cool season grasses and 2 warm season grasses. The 2 cool season grasses were perennial ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass, and the 2 warm season grasses were buffalo grass and zoysia grass. And I looked at multiple mowing heights. One was being close to a lawn height at 2.5 to 3 inches. Also could be considered a golf course rough height, so right around that lawn height. And then I looked at a lower mowing height that would be kind of considered a golf course fairway at around 1/2 inch height. So I looked at different mowing heights with these different species, but then I also looked at applying traffic, in this case golf cart traffic, and how is that impacted when these grasses are under a period of drought stress. And so this was conducted under a rainout shelter, as you can see in the picture there, where we're preventing any precipitation occurring on these plots, and we turned off any irrigation, so it's not getting any irrigation. So this picture here is 40 days without any irrigation or rainfall. By this time, this is early August, so it's throughout the entire month of July. It's been under some heat stress as well. And you can just see just visually here, just the differences of buffalo grass and zoysia grass, those 2 warm season grasses. We still got green turf. We got healthy growing turf. Obviously, the growth is slowed down at this point compared to those cool season grasses, though, that are not looking well. They have less heat and drought stress tolerance. And so just kind of summarize up cool season versus warm season grasses and some different characteristics. The cool season grasses are going to be more adapted to cooler climates, whereas the warm season are adapted to more warmer climates, just like in the name. The cool season grasses are going to have better cold and winter hardiness, whereas the warm season grasses are going to do really well and have better heat and drought stress tolerance in our summers here in Kansas. The cool season grasses are generally better adapted to less sunlight. So most of the cool season grasses have better shade tolerance. Whereas the warm season grasses typically need a little bit more sunlight, and they're a little more efficient in full sunlight conditions. And so if your lawn has some shade stress, you may need to really do more of your homework and kind of figure out, okay, well, there are differences of warm season grasses, such as zoysia grass has better shade tolerance than, say, Bermuda grass and buffalo grass. So then you'd want to make sure you do pick, if you're picking a warm season grass, you pick one that has a little bit better shade tolerance compared to others. But as a whole, cool season grasses do have better shade tolerance than warm season grasses. The cool season grasses, they're going to maintain their green color into winter and potentially start to lose some of that green color, late winter in January or February, but then quickly start to green back up in March. Whereas our warm season grasses, they have that true winter dormant period where they lose their green color. Could be anywhere from beginning of November or mid to late November throughout the winter months, December, January, and February, even into March, and before things start to warm back up and they start to get some green color again. So this can be a hindrance to some people not liking that dormant brown color in the wintertime. They want some green color, but I'll defend that by, well, you have less mowing going on in the late fall and early spring months. So I look at that as an advantage. It's not growing, it's sitting dormant. I'm not having to mow my lawn as much. That's less inputs right there. And I'm also having to not fertilize as much either. So there's more periods out of the year where it's just dormant. And so there are other examples, obviously, of cool season and warm season plants here. So just kind of put this in perspective. If you think about vegetables and whatnot, we have cool season plants like carrots and beets and radishes that do really well in those early spring months, those cooler temperatures. Whereas we also have warm season plants, just like our warm season turf grasses, like corn and melons and tomatoes, that we need that heat We need those warmer periods because they have more growth, they're more optimum air temperatures. So as far as winter color differences, as I mentioned, we have this kind of true dormant period, winter dormancy period for warm season grasses, so compared to cool season grasses. So here's a picture in Indiana where the tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass mixture on the left is still got green color, and in this case, this is early spring. You can see there's no trees on the leaves, whereas the zoysia grass has that kind of golden brown true winter dormancy. There's some green color there in the zoysia grass, but that's just actually some tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass grass growing through that. And then we see, here's another example. We have some zoysia grass here with that dormant golden brown color, and we have some cool season grasses surrounding it that are still green in the wintertime. And then here's another example. This is Colbert Hills Golf Course in Manhattan, Kansas. We have a dormant zoysia grass fairway with tall fescue and creeping bentgrass, two cool season grasses surrounding the zoysia grass that has that dormant brown color. On the flip side, if we looked at, okay, what about in the summertime? Well, now we're going to kind of see the opposite, where the cool season grasses may go into some sort of summer dormancy where they're not getting enough water and they're shutting down and start to turn a brown color in the summertime. And that would be like tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass here on the right side, losing color, whereas Bermuda grass that has better drought and heat tolerance is still maintaining green color because it's using less water. It's still able to grow during that heat stress period. So all in all, there's many facts to consider when we're looking at cool season versus warm season turf grasses. The biggest one obviously is going to be water conservation. That's going to be an important issue for the rest of our lives. So we really got to start thinking about this and actually putting things into action as far as reducing our water amounts. And so the biggest impact we can have as far as reducing that water and how much we're watering our lawns is to start switching over to warm season grasses. These warm season grasses do really well in the heat and the drought stress of summer. They use less water. They have a more efficient photosynthesis cycle. So we can apply less water and they'll do just fine instead of trying to grow a cool season grass summer after summer during that heat and drought stress period and just dumping a lot of water on it to maintain green color. And then the second biggest impact that I would say in home lawns is we need to start thinking about smart management practices. So we can make the switch to warm season grasses, but if you're still hesitant and you don't want to switch over to warm season grass, then you need to start thinking about doing other smart management practices as far as your irrigation practices, your fertilization practices, and then different mowing practices as well, and put those into action to reduce your inputs and still have an acceptable quality lawn. All right, so next we're going to look at some warm season options for Kansas. What would those be? So for each grass here, I'm going to kind of break it down by its Latin name, some primary uses, what's its growth habit. That'll be a key feature. I'll list some examples of cultivars. Some of the cultivars I list are not, you should not be growing in Kansas. I'll highlight which ones do have better cold tolerance and can be grown in Kansas. And then some positive and negative attributes of each of these warm season grasses. All right, so the first one here is buffalo grass. So buffalo grass, it's a low maintenance grass. It's known for its low inputs as far as fertilizer, irrigation, mowing, and so on. So it does really well on low input lawns, other turf areas, roadsides. It can even be used on golf courses if they're looking at like a low maintenance golf course rough or a fairway or cemeteries. So it has a lot of usage in Kansas, especially from the central part of Kansas out to western Kansas. It does really well kind of under those drought conditions. This is one grass being a low maintenance grass that if we start to apply too much water to it, it can actually decrease the quality of that grass. You can have more weeds infesting buffalo grass than if you were to not water it at all. Its growth habit is stoloniferous, so it's going to be spreading by above ground lateral stems, and that's a really good thing. It's going to help it recover if it has any damage. It's going to also help it establish faster as well. And so this is one that is native to Kansas and the Great Plains of the United States. It's been found throughout all the states from Texas all the way up to Canada. So it has really good cold tolerance, and so it's one that's been here before us in Kansas. It can do really well in our climate. The one thing with buffalo grass is it is dioecious, so it's going to have both the male and female flowers on the plants, and so I'll show you that here in the next slide. And so as you start to grow this and maybe have it at lawn height, maybe a 3-inch to 3.5-inch mowing height or 4 inches, you could start to see these flowers, both the female there and the male flowers that show up, and it can start the seeds. If you kind of let it, you can let it kind of go to seed at the, it's one of those grasses that doesn't actually grow that high compared to other grasses like tall fescue and so on. It maybe gets up to about 5 to 6 inches, and that's about the maximum height it's going to get. And then it can actually start to go to seed at that height and repopulate itself from seed. But it is also perennial, so it's going to come back year after year. All right, some cultivars of buffalo grass. We have some seeded cultivars that you can purchase by seed, and there's a variety. There's a list there, and all these would be acceptable in Kansas. They can all tolerate our winters. They'll survive our winters and also obviously our summertime. And then there is certain cultivars of buffalo grass that can only be purchased and established vegetatively, meaning by either sod or by sprigging it or plugging it. And so there's the list there with such as Legacy, 609, and so on. And so it's really depending on what you're looking for. Are you looking for buffalo grass seed? That's going to narrow the list down depending on what cultivars you can choose there. Or are you looking for a vegetative cultivar that, and really the only main thing there is the vegetative cultivars just don't produce enough seed to be able to sell by seed, or that seed is just not viable compared to the seeded cultivars. All right, some positive attributes of buffalo grass. It has excellent heat, cold, and drought tolerance. It's going to do really well in our Kansas, the climate all across Kansas. It's going to be pretty fast to spread if we're trying to establish this, whether by seed or by plugging it with those stolen spreading. It's going to help fill in any damaged areas as well. It is a low maintenance turf, so it's one that requires very few inputs. You really don't have to fertilize this every single year. You can just give it a little bit and it does really well. Same goes for irrigation. It can survive under non-irrigated conditions really well. So if you're if you have a home lawn that has no irrigation system and you're in central to western Kansas, I would highly recommend trying to grow buffalo grass, especially if you have in areas that with full sun or maybe just slightly partial shade, it'll still do pretty well. And it can really tolerate a wide range of mowing heights. Obviously, a home lawn around that 3 to 4 inch height is best, and you'll probably get the best quality of it. But as far as at our research center, we've had this down to about a little higher than a 1/2 inch height to kind of simulate a golf course fairway, and we can get it down to a low height. But for most home lawns, you should pretty much be mowing around a 3 to 4 inch height. And with buffalo grass being low maintenance, it actually has very few diseases and pests that impact it. So it's another key advantage for buffalo grass. You don't have to worry about really any diseases in the summertime, and there's not a lot of pests that will attack it. All right, some negatives with buffalo grass is it's generally not used on a high quality turf area. So depending on what your expectations are and really what you're looking for, this isn't going to produce as high quality as say Bermuda grass or Zoysia grass warm season lawn. And just like the other warm season lawns I'll be talking about today, it will go dormant in the wintertime, typically with that first hard frost about mid-October in Kansas, but that can vary a few weeks earlier or later in the year to where then it starts to lose all of its color in the wintertime, and then it'll green back up next spring. And then could be a negative attribute. Some like the color. I like it. It's kind of got a lighter green color. We call it kind of a grayish green color compared to our traditional turfgrass species with that kind of vibrant green color. So it's a little bit different looking, but it still looks really good. And then the other negative attribute with buffalo grass is the seed and sod can be expensive. It's a small market for buffalo grass. There's only a few growers in Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma. And there's some sod producers as well for buffalo grass. So it's a smaller market. It's a little bit harder to come by. So you might have to purchase, if you're trying to purchase seed or sod, you're going to have to pay a little bit more upfront for this. But you got to be thinking long term, this is going to save you a lot in the long run as far as less fertilizer, less irrigation being applied. Really no pesticides are going to be needed, maybe some weed control here or there, but a lot less inputs in the long run. So you can save money with those a little bit more higher upfront costs. And then another negative attribute, I kind of already mentioned this, but if you start to apply too much fertilizer, if you start to manage this buffalo grass as you would say Bermuda grass or tall fescue or Kentucky bluegrass, applying a lot of nitrogen fertilizer or water, you can actually start to decrease the overall quality and the density of buffalo grass. So you got to really keep in mind, what is the species I'm managing, and then what how much is actually required. You can't treat all these species the same. All right, next moving on to zoysia grass. So zoysia grass, there's multiple different zoysia grasses. As you can see here, we got Zoysia japonica, Zoysia matrella, and so on. And really the key one to focus here on is Zoysia japonica, which is also known as Japanese lawn grass. And the reason we're not talking about Zoysia matrella, which is Manila grass, is it has less cold tolerance than Zoysia japonica. So typically we want to find cultivars for Kansas that contain japonica or have a japonica by matrella. They've been crossed with matrella, but still have that japonica traits, being cold tolerant enough for our Kansas winters. So primary uses for zoysia grass, it can be used in a variety of different areas, just like buffalo grass. Home lawns, it does really well. This one does also really well in Kansas on golf course fairways. So you'll find it in Manhattan, Kansas at Covert Hills on its golf course fairway, but also all over in different golf courses in Kansas City and so on. It does really well at that lower mowing height, especially on tee boxes as well. So this one's used throughout the transition zone on golf courses, but you can also find it in home lawns, and it does really well in home lawns. I have some of this in my lawn at home, and it does really well. I'm not fertilizing it nearly as much as, say, my tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass, other portion of my lawn. So it does really well. Just like buffalo grass, it's kind of a low input, low maintenance turf grass. So for the growth habit of zoysia grass, it's both rhizomatous, which is below ground lateral stems, and stoloniferous. So it spreads by both types of lateral stems, which is a good thing. It's going to help fill in areas if anything gets damaged, but also going to help it establish both below ground and above ground. And so this one's native to Japan, Korea, and other Asian countries. It was brought over in the early 1900s, and it's been around here in the United States for over 100 years now. And through breeding at different universities, we've got some really good cultivars of zoysia grass that do well at both home lawn height, but also at golf course fairway height. So some cultivars of zoysia grass here I'm listing. These are all ones that really should be able to survive and have shown to survive our Kansas winters year after year. And the ones I have highlighted here for the vegetative cold hardy, such as Innovation, that was recently released in 2018, and that's a K-State, Texas A&M University joint release that we've done research on that over 10 to 12 years, multiple, obviously 10 to 12 winters in Kansas. And then the DALZ 1701, that's just its experimental name right now, but it will have a commercial name similar to such as Innovation. And that is a more recent release coming out here in 2023 between Texas A&M, K-State, and Purdue. Joint collaboration there. And whenever we release one of these new cultivars, it actually takes about 10 to 12 years through multiple years of testing at multiple sites around the country to make sure it's got enough cold winter hardiness to survive our winters, but it also has better traits and characteristics compared to older cultivars. And so one of the most commonly used cultivars in Kansas is, as you can see at the top there, Meyer, which is a Zoysia japonica, and that was released back in 1951, but it's still one of the most commonly used ones because it has really good cold tolerance. It doesn't get a lot of winter kill, but we can still see winter kill if we have an extreme winter event where we have a polar vortex or something coming down from Canada. But these newer ones, such as Innovation and the DALZ 1701, these are ones that we tested them against Meyer, and they have better traits and characteristics compared to Meyer. And then we have other vegetative cultivars, but these are not cold hardy, so I wouldn't recommend any of these for Kansas because you will experience extreme winter kill. And those would be like Zorro or Diamond or Empire. So a lot of those are the Zoysia matrella or other hybrids through testing that we've seen that don't have good cold tolerance. So those are all vegetative zoysia grass cultivars on the previous slide, meaning they have to be planted either by sod, sprigs, or plugging. So you'll need to contact a sod producer or a garden store that sells zoysia grass. You won't be able to find it by seed, but there are, in this case, just one cultivar of zoysia grass that's still available in the market, and that's Zenith, which is a Zoysia japonica. And that one you can still buy by seed and plant it by seed. So there's very little zoysia grass that can be purchased and seeded. Most of them, and I'll talk about this next with the Bermuda grass, most of them need to be planted vegetatively. So positive attributes for zoysia grass, just like buffalo grass, it's adapted to a wide range of mowing heights down to a 1/4 inch all the way up to lawn heights. And it's also dependent on cultivar, but the ones I mentioned, the vegetative cultivars that are cold hardy, those will do really well at our lawn heights. It has excellent heat tolerance, it has good drought tolerance, and really good traffic and wear tolerance. So if you have an area that's getting kind of beat up some foot traffic from the kids or from the dog, it'll hold up to some good foot traffic compared to, say, buffalo grass. It does have good cold tolerance. And so all the grasses I'm talking about today, like buffalo grass, zoysia grass, and Bermuda grass, obviously buffalo grass being native to Kansas has really good cold tolerance, but zoysia grass is pretty close behind having really good cold tolerance when we compare that to, say, Bermuda grass, which I'll be talking about next, which has probably the least cold tolerance of these three. And then I've already kind of mentioned this, but this one has actually, zoysia grass has pretty good shade tolerance, especially when we compare it to Bermuda grass, which is kind of the main, one of the main weaknesses of Bermuda grass. It doesn't do well under shaded environments. And then zoysia grass is also labeled as one of these low input turf grass species because there is very few pests of different diseases or insects that actually impact zoysia grass. And then it has an excellent density, so it'll really get a real thick density, and that's a good thing. It's going to help it really reduce any infestation of weeds, so you have less weed pressure, and then in turn you'll be applying less herbicides for weed control because you won't need it because it's going to be kind of choking out those weeds. And so I already kind of mentioned this. It's a low input grass. It's got a really slow vertical growth rate, which is a hindrance as far as it might take it a little bit longer to get established, but once it's established, you might not need to mow it as much. So there's less mowing required, there's less fertilization required. And then, as I just mentioned, less pesticides required because there's less weed pressure if you have a nicely 100% stand of zoysia grass. So this figure here is just kind of showing differences of these different cultivars and testing that we do at K-State. And so here we have Innovation and Meyer, those two vegetative cold hardy zoysia grass cultivars compared to Xeon and Empire that have that Zoysia matrella. And you can see the less winter hardiness, and they have more winter injury. In this case, these are exhibiting pretty much 100% winter kill compared to Innovation and Meyer, which will, again, those are good for our Kansas climates. They will survive. You might notice some winter kill here and there, but for the most part, it's going to be pretty low compared to these Zoysia matrella types. All right, some negatives with zoysia grass, though, as I mentioned, with that slow growth rate, it can be slow to establish. You need to be patient, but once you get it established, you can really back off on the inputs. Most of the cultivars need to be established vegetatively, as I mentioned, through sprigs, plugs, or sod. So there's not a lot of options if you're trying to seed zoysia grass. In relation to that slow growth rate, it could have slow recuperative potential. So if you get some areas that are damaged, depending on the size of that area, it might take a little while for it to recover and completely fill back in. You might need to be moving around some plugs and kind of encourage that area to recover a little bit faster. And then just like the other warm season grasses, it's going to have that kind of true winter brown dormancy during the wintertime. And then you could potentially have some thatch problems, and this is really attributed to depending on how much are you fertilizing that zoysia grass. Are you over fertilizing? That's going to cause thatch problems. You don't need to typically fertilize as much. Also, your mowing heights, what height are you mowing at? That could potentially cause some thatch problems as well, say compared to buffalo grass. So your best mowing quality is going to be with the reel mower, which is a mower on a cylindrical drum that's spinning around with a bed knife like they use on golf courses and sports fields, where we typically in our home lawns, we are using rotary mowers, whether it's a push or a riding mower with a rotary blade spinning or multiple blades spinning. But you can still get good looking zoysia grass turf with a rotary blade. Especially if for a home lawn height for zoysia grass, you could actually mow it a little bit lower compared to, say, tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. We typically recommend if you're managing a cool season lawn, I'd recommend managing that height between 3 to 4 inches, which might seem a little high to some, but you're going to get a better overall density of that tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass. But if you're managing zoysia grass or Bermuda grass for a home lawn height, you actually want to manage that closer around to 2 inch to even a little bit less than that. You'll get a better overall turf quality with that warm season grass. And then lastly, another negative with zoysia grass is it sometimes gets large patch disease, which you can kind of see in the middle picture there. And most of that will recover, but it might be a little thinned out. You might have some weeds infesting that, so you'll have to have some weed control in those areas. But that's not usually a problem at home lawn height. That's typically more of a problem at a lower mowing height, like a fairway mowing height around 1/2 inch. All right, moving along to Bermuda grass, another warm season grass that we can grow in Kansas. There's different types of Bermuda grass. We have common Bermuda grass, but we also have this hybrid improved Bermuda grass that's a cross there that's been crossed through multiple breeding programs. And so just like zoysia grass and buffalo grass, Bermuda grass has many different uses, both home lawns, but also sports fields it does really well, and also golf course turf as well. And so this is one that's probably the most popular and most commonly grown grass in the southern United States. because it has a lot of different functional characteristics, and it can be used at a lot of different mowing heights. Just like zoysia grass, it's rhizomatous and stoloniferous, so it spreads by both above ground and below ground stems. And then for its cultivars, we have some cold hardy ones, but we also have some less cold hardy ones you need to be aware of to make sure you don't purchase and try to grow those here in Kansas, because they will get winter injury. So for our vegetative ones, meaning they only can be planted again by plugs, sprigs, or sod, we have cold hardy ones, and the ones I would really focus on there is the ones in the orange, such as Patriot, Latitude 36, Northbridge, and Tahoma 31. Those are recent Oklahoma State, that's OSU there, releases. Another one is Iron Cutter, that's from Mountain View Genetics. But through research, we've seen that Northbridge, Latitude 36, and Tahoma 31, they can survive our winters. And again, you might get a little winter injury here or there, but they should, you're not going to get complete kill on that Bermuda grass. Then there's other vegetative ones, as you can see there, that are less cold hardy, and they will not survive our Kansas winters. And then there is a few seeded varieties that are cold hardy, such as Monaco and Rio, and then a few others that are Oklahoma State releases, but they're most of those are off market. The one you'll probably find as far as seeded cultivars is Monaco. That's really the only one that's currently available on market. So there's, again, just like zoysia grass, there's not a lot of options if we're trying to seed zoysia grass or Bermuda grass for our home lawns. Zoysia grass was native to the Asian countries. Buffalo grass is native to Kansas and the Great Plains here. Well, Bermuda grass is native to Africa and Australia, and it was brought over during the slave trade. And it's really just taken over the southern United States because of the climate. It really likes the climate, but it can also do really well in our Kansas climate as well. So some positives with Bermuda grass: it has excellent recovery, recuperative potential. So if you have any sort of injury, it's got a little bit faster growth rate than zoysia grass, so it's going to be able to fill in any areas quicker. That means it's also going to be quicker to establish. And it's got really excellent heat, drought, and traffic tolerance, and it handles soil compaction a little bit better, and it can handle salt tolerance better. If you are applying any salt to your sidewalks or so on, it won't get injured as much as some other grasses. Just like zoysia grass, it can tolerate a wide range of mowing heights, but even wider range than zoysia grass. There's some cultivars that can be mowed down to 1/8 of an inch, like a golf course putting green. But this will also do really well at our home lawn heights. Typically again, just like I mentioned, for zoysia grass, these warm season grasses can be mowed a little bit shorter. So around about 2 inches for Bermuda grass home lawn height will look really well. And so here's just an example of it down at that 1/8 of an inch. And this is in Florida. So we don't see this in Kansas because these hybrid Bermuda grasses have less cold tolerance. But in the southern parts of the United States, these can really tolerate that low mowing height. So you'll see it on a lot of golf courses in the southern United States. Here's University of Florida's football field, and so it's an excellent playing surface because it has that fast recovery potential. So you can imagine how much damage some of these football fields are getting from the players during games. And so you'll see Bermuda grass a lot on fields, and such as the Kansas City Chiefs. Their football field is Bermuda grass, and then they do overseed it with a cool season grass going into the winter months to maintain green color all the way up to the playoffs. But for the most half of that season, it's Bermuda grass. And so a little background here on Bermuda grass breeding. The genetics program at Oklahoma State University was started by Dr. Taliaferro there, and he developed many different cold hardy types with the focus of, hey, we need to look for more Bermuda grass cultivars that can withstand these cold winters of Oklahoma and Kansas. And so they developed and released a lot, such as Yukon, Riviera, Patriot, Northbridge, and Latitude 36. Some of those are still available and are still really good cultivars that we can be growing in Kansas. And since then, he's retired, and Dr. Wu has taken over since 2006. And he's released multiple cultivars, such as Tahoma 31, and there's a few more coming out this year and next, and in a couple of years. That, again, the focus here is looking for Bermuda grass cultivars that can withstand colder winters. And so we can start to move Bermuda grass in more northern states, such as Kansas, maybe even southern Nebraska. It's not going to have as much winter injury. So some negatives with Bermuda grass. Compared to zoysia grass and buffalo, it does have a little bit less cold tolerance. And so there's more chance of winter injury occurring on Bermuda grass than there is on zoysia or buffalo grass. It does have less shade tolerance than zoysia grass. And it can also be a little bit more higher water user, require more water than, say, buffalo grass or zoysia grass. And then it is susceptible to a little bit more diseases such as spring dead spot and some other diseases compared to buffalo grass and zoysia grass. So Bermuda grass is not one we typically label as a low input turf grass species. And it does have a little bit faster growth rate, which is a good and a bad thing. It's going to help it establishing and fill in quicker if you're trying to establish Bermuda grass, and also help it recover if you do get any damage. But on the flip side of that, as a negative, the faster growth rate might mean you need to mow it a little bit more often compared to buffalo grass or zoysia grass. And then it can also be creeping into your landscape beds, and so you'll need a little bit more management of killing that off or manually pulling it out, getting it out, and it can be acting as a weed in that situation. And then just like our other warm season grasses, it can kind of go that dormant. It's going to go dormant brown in the wintertime, just like our other C4 grasses. And so one last one I want to mention here, and it's not that common, but we do see it in the western parts of the state, and especially in eastern Colorado, is blue grama. And so blue grama, it's actually part of the same genus as buffalo grass, Blutula, and its primary uses is low maintenance turf areas, and it's often mixed in that case with buffalo grass. So blue grama is a bunch type growth habit, so it's going to be not able to recover or fill in areas as well as say buffalo grass, which is a stoloniferous grass. So that's why it's often mixed when established. And there's very few cultivars available on the market to find for blue grama. So this would be if you're in really the western side of the state and you potentially are thinking about doing buffalo grass, well, you could be trying to do some sort of mixture if you wanted to have two different species, and these will blend well together, blue grama and buffalo grass. And so then I would be thinking about it, but there are a few out there as far as commercially available cultivars. You'll have to do a little bit of researching on the internet and try to find some there though. Some positives with blue grama: it's got excellent heat, drought, and cold tolerance, just like buffalo grass. It's going to be good for a low maintenance area. So it's again looking at some low maintenance sites that you would typically plant as buffalo grass, just sort of doing a mixture. Some negatives though with blue grama: it's going to be a little bit slower to establish and spread, especially since it's a bunch type growth habit. It's not going to be spreading by any lateral stems. And so in that case, you really want to be thinking about using it as a mixture. And you got to keep in mind, this isn't going to produce a high quality turf. So you got to lower your expectations. And so those align with what you're actually going to be able to get out of having a blue grama turf grass system. All right, so the last kind of few minutes of this webinar here, I just kind of want to talk about best management practice and just a quick refresher on kind of getting our mindset of, doesn't matter what grass we're managing, we got to make sure we're putting forward the best management practices to reduce our inputs, but we can still maintain an acceptable quality turf in a home lawn setting. And so these practices, they're going to increase your turf quality and improve the overall health of your turf, improve the overall density of your turf stand. That's kind of our end goal here. And so first, just looking at irrigation tips. When we think about irrigation, we talk about evapotranspiration. You might have seen this term before, such as ET for short, and that's evaporation. Think about the plant system, that's evaporation from the soil, but also transpiration of that water moving through the plant from its roots, through the leaves, and being lost to the atmosphere. So we combine that together, being evapotranspiration. And we express that evapotranspiration in units of depth of water over time. And so in this case, inches per day of water loss or inches per week. And so there's multiple factors that affect evapotranspiration of how much water is being lost from the soil and transpiring through the leaves. And there's many different devices and ways to measure this, and different weather stations or climate databases on the internet where you can get ET data to see how much water is being used based on many different factors I'm about to list out here. So one of the biggest factors obviously is our weather conditions. As we increase our air temperature, then we increase how much water is being used. We have higher ET rates, right? If we increase the day length, so we have longer sunlight, more sunlight during the day, we have longer days in the summertime, we have higher ET rates. If we decrease our relative humidity, so the air is drier, more water is going to be pulled through the plant and lost from the soil and moved into the air, so we have higher ET rates. If we have more wind speed going across the plant, disrupting the boundary layer on the plant, more water is going to be pulled from the plant and from the soil as it's drying, so we also have higher ET rates. So there's a lot of different things you got to be thinking about, as far as we can't be watering our grass or our plants the same every single day or from season to season, from spring or fall. Obviously, there's different how much water is actually being used based on those weather conditions. The other thing to think about is species and cultivars. So I've talked about warm season grasses a lot today here, and in our warm season grasses, they have better heat stress tolerance, they have better drought tolerance, so they typically have lower evapotranspiration rates as well. They just have a more efficient photosynthetic pathway. They are using that carbon molecule more efficiently. They're using the water more efficiently, so they can get by with less water. So compared to cool season grasses or C3 turf grasses, if you're managing warm season grasses, you'll have lower ET rates, so you don't need to be watering as much. The other thing to think about is if you're managing a grass that's growing faster, it's using more water more often, so it needs to be watered more often. And then we got to be thinking about our cultural practices. If we're maintaining a really wet soil, that's more water to be pulled up in the plant, so we're going to be using more water. We have a higher ET rate. If you're fertilizing the plants more and have a faster growth rate, again, we're going to have higher ET rates as well. And then site conditions. Obviously, a full sun area in the lawn compared to a shaded site in the lawn, it's going to be drying out faster. We're going to have higher ET rates. Sloped areas are going to have higher ET rates. And then if you have a sandier soil, you're not going to have you're not going to have as high water holding capacity compared to a more clay soil. And so you're going to have to be watering more frequently. So there's a lot of things to take into consideration here when we're talking about irrigation. But the next slide here, I'm just going to kind of summarize a lot of this up. And the main thing we want to be thinking about when we're watering our lawns is we want to be spacing out those irrigation events. If we're watering, whether it's an above ground hose and sprinkler system, or you have an in-ground irrigation system, you should not be watering your lawn every single day. Once or twice a week during the summertime is plenty. And when you do water, you put enough water to where it's pushing the water down into the soil profile, completely wetting the soil profile, so you have a deeper root system. And that's going to help it be ready for more drought periods that it may experience in the summertime. And so you don't want to water every day. You want to be looking at the current weather and the forecasted weather. You know, you don't want to, if it's a 90% chance of rain tomorrow, there's no reason to be irrigating your lawn. It can probably make it one more day, and hopefully it can be rain fed and get water that way. And so one way to do this is be looking at what's the current weather, what's the current rainfall amounts. You really should be aware through the Kansas State University, we have the Kansas Mesonet and multiple different weather stations throughout the state. And this is all freely accessible data. And you get up-to-date current precipitation amounts of what's going on and how much rainfall is occurring. And so you can see that in real time and get that data. The other thing to think about with watering is you're going to want to scout and wait until you have slightly visible wilt systems appearing. And so be checking your lawn, making sure if it's not looking for drought systems, then you wait and hold off on that irrigation event until you have some footprinting, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner here, or some loss of green color, and then apply that irrigation. And that's going to help that plant. If it experiences a little bit of drought stress, it's good for it. And it's going to want to seek out with deeper root systems in the soil profile to find that. And you have a stronger root system overall. All right, next, just some mowing tips. I can't stress this enough. If anytime you can raise your mowing height, you will have a more healthy, dense stand of turf. And so that you also will be not having to mow as often. A lot of people think, oh, if I mow it lower, I won't have to mow as often. But what happens then is they're probably scalping the turf, taking off too much vegetation, and it actually stunts the grass. It's really detrimental to the overall health of the plant. And it might seem like you're not mowing as often, but if you actually raise the mowing height, through research, we've shown if you're following the 1/3 rule, you will actually not have to mow as often. You can save on some mowing inputs. And so that 1/3 rule is just removing only 1/3 of the leaf tissue, and it's not as detrimental as far as taking off more of the leaf tissue compared to 1/3. The other thing is, do not bag your clippings. I still see this too often enough, people bagging their clippings, removing that vegetation from the site, putting it in landfills. It's such a waste. Or even if it's going to be recycled, it's a waste. You're actually removing fertilizer and nutrients from your plant system and taking them off site. Whereas if you were returning those clippings to the turf surface when you're following the 1/3 rule, it's not going to contribute to thatch, and you're actually reducing the amount of fertilizer you need because you're producing nutrients back into that system. The other one not many people think about is just alternating your mowing direction. So changing up the mowing direction of your lawn each time, it's going to help that turf grass stand more upright, make an overall healthier, dense stand of turf. And then lastly, just maintaining blade sharpness and proper maintenance on your equipment to get the most efficient. When you're mowing, your equipment's working at the most efficiency, and you're getting a better overall quality of cut. All right, lastly, just looking at fertilization tips is when you're developing a fertilization program, they're typically developed around how much nitrogen is needed. That's the main thing we're always focusing on, is the plant needs the most is nitrogen. So you got to look at what are your site conditions, what type of soil do you have, and then also what are your expectations. And so when we're making nitrogen the primary focus of fertilization programs, we need to think about fertilizing cool season grasses and warm season grasses. They should be occurring at different times of the year. So what do you currently have in your lawn, or what are you planting in your lawn? And that's going to start to dictate when should you be fertilizing. So if we're looking at cool season grasses, and if you're trying to manage a cool season grasses, well, then you should be putting down most of your nitrogen fertilizer in the fall, but then you could maybe put a second app or two in the springtime, but we really want to withstand from fertilizing at all in the summertime during the heat and the drought stress. Now, on the flip side of that is if we're managing these warm season grasses like I talked about today, we actually want to be putting down most of our fertilizer in the summer months. We don't want to be fertilizing in the fall as it's going dormant in the wintertime, but also we don't want to be putting down nitrogen fertilizer in the springtime when we don't have a lot of active growth occurring with these warm season grasses. So you got to take that into consideration. All right, so lastly, just looking at these management practices, when I was living in Indiana for 4 years, I moved into a house that had new development and the lawns were being established. All my neighbors' lawns were being established at the same time. And so I started thinking, I'm going to put in practice all these best management practices right away and see what the actual differences are compared to my neighbor who wasn't obviously putting into these practices. So I looked at, okay, I'm going to be applying a deep and infrequent irrigation only during periods of drought. I didn't have an in-ground irrigation system, so I just used a hose and a sprinkler when it got really dry in the summertime when needed. I increased my mowing height, and then I only fertilized my cool season lawn at the proper timing like we talk about. And so here is my lawn on the right and my neighbor's lawn on the left. And this is after 3 years, and both of these, all this turf was sodded at the same time from the same sod farm. It's a tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass mixture that were all established in the fall of 2017. And this is 2.5 years later of just raising my mowing height for 2.5 years, only irrigating during drought periods, and only fertilizing mainly in the fall with a little bit in the springtime. So this is a cool season grass, but if this was warm season, I would only fertilize in the summertime. And so this is just putting together these best management practices. And I'm not applying, I should mention, no pesticides were applied to my lawn here. I did not apply any herbicides, no fungicides, or no insecticides. And so you can see the differences here, just putting together some of these best management practices. Whereas my neighbor is mowing too low. He's mowing at about 2-inch height for these tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass. That's too low. You shouldn't be mowing your home lawns around 2 inches. He also wasn't applying any nitrogen fertilizer. And so then this is 3.5 years later. This is after a whole nother summer. And you can see still those differences. And at this point, again, I'm still doing all the same stuff. No pesticides have been applied to my lawn, whereas my neighbor continued to mow too low, did not apply any fertilizer, and infrequently mowing, and then obviously not watering during some drought periods. And now we have a lot more going on here with a lot more weeds showing up. All right, so in summary today, Kansas, it's in the transition zone, so we can grow both cool season and warm season grasses. It's really important to know these differences between these two species. Most often we see tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass in Kansas for our cool season grasses. And then for warm season grasses, we can be growing buffalo grass, Zoysia grass, and Bermuda grass. All three of these are great choices for Kansas, especially if you're looking to reduce the amount of water and other inputs, and also still have a nice green lawn in the summertime compared to tall fescue or Kentucky bluegrass or any of these other cool season grasses. And so they have, just because they have better heat stress and drought stress tolerance. So therefore, there's greater water savings potential if we're looking at a warm season grass, and that's one big reason from a long-term sustainability viewpoint, I would be making the switch to a warm season grass compared to a cool season grass. And regardless if you're going to manage a cool season or warm season species, you really need to be thinking about just making sure you're applying these best management practices at the correct time of the year, the correct amounts, and so on. And that's going to help you save water because you're going to have a more acceptable looking turf that you don't need to be applying a lot of water to, and a more healthier and dense turf as well. That's going to help reduce the amount of weeds infesting that lawn as well. All right, and that's all I got for you today. We can open this up for questions. Thanks for attending.
Thank you for all the great information there, Dr. Braun. Lots of great information that I know I'll take home and utilize as well. I'll turn it over to Sharon Ashworth here to ask a few of the many questions that you all have from the Q&A.
Thank you. We have just a few moments here. So Dr. Braun, if you would maybe answer in quick fashion with some of these, if you're able. So the first question is for products like Hydratane, is that in any way helpful?
Hydratane is not one I've heard of. I'm guessing that's some sort of water soil penetrant or
Mhm.
something like that. As far as trying to save water, that's not a long-term approach. I'd have to look into that product more though. Sorry, I can't really answer that one.
Okay, thank you. We do have questions about mixing warm and cool season. So the first question is warm season grasses spreading and invading the neighbor's yard who has cool season grasses. Is there any way to mitigate that?
Yeah, that is a challenge. So depending on how, like such as Bermuda grass that can spread pretty fast, that can be a challenge. And so there are different pesticide products, different herbicides that can take out some of the warm season grasses compared to the cool season grasses. It's really dependent on the time of year you apply that. And the other option is communicating with your neighbor who's trying to manage a cool season grass, making sure they're fertilizing at the proper time of year for the cool season grass that's going to help it compete against the warm season grass. So fertilizing that cool season grass in the fall to give it more growth and kind of help outcompete and compete against that warm season grass that's going dormant in the wintertime, right? And then you might have to do maybe some edging or something to help maybe cut some of those stolons or rhizomes from spreading as fast.
Great, thank you. And then a couple questions on planting seed. One is about mixing warm and cool season seeding. And also, can you seed Bermuda grass without removing the fescue? So a couple
Yes, so
questions.
as far as mixing that, we've done some research at K-State as far as mixing warm and cool season grasses, such as mixing zoysia grass and a tall fescue. There's been others such as mixing Bermuda grass and Kentucky bluegrass. So there are options as far as mixing so it's doable. The one thing I would make sure is just to make sure you understand what that may look like as far as your expectations, to make sure that your expectations actually align with what the reality is going to show up as. So depending on what you have as a mixture, whether it's a 50-50 or 60-40 or so on, at some points of the year, obviously in the summertime, you might not be able to tell the difference and it's all going to look green, right? Spring through the fall. But in the wintertime, you're not going to have a completely 100% dormant turf, and you're going to have some spots of green turf growing through that. And if that's okay with you, then that it works. Personally, I would rather just have a 100% dormant looking warm season turf instead of having some green turf growing through that. Because what happens then in the late fall or the early spring is you might have to go out there and just mow some spots, where if it was 100% dormant warm season turf, you're not having to mow it at all, right? So, and then the other part as far as have tall fescue and can I seed with Bermuda grass without removing the tall fescue? You potentially could. Depends on how thick the tall fescue is. If it's pretty thinned out, you could probably seed in some Bermuda grass. And if your end goal there is to get it switched over to Bermuda grass, it may take more time. But if you just want some sort of mixture, it can be feasible to seed in with some Bermuda grass to get that mixed in.
Great. We do have some more questions, but I see that we are past the 1 o'clock hour. So I'm going to turn this over to Matthew.
Very good. Well, thank you, Dr. Braun, for all the great information. As always, we have way more questions than we have time for, but we'll be sure to include some references and resources on the website when we post the video tomorrow. And if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to your local extension office and we'd be happy to help. Once again, thank you for joining the K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We're so glad to have you here today to learn about drought-tolerant lawns of Kansas. We have several interesting sessions coming up, including our next presentation on solutions to your top garden insect and disease problems coming up on Wednesday, July 5th. So be sure to visit the K-State Garden Hour website for all of our upcoming topics or to make your tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of this webinar series. You should be able to find that link in our chat. This session was recorded and will be posted to the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you'll be prompted to take an evaluation survey, so please fill that out. We greatly appreciate your feedback. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach us at gardenhour@ksu.edu for more information. Thank you again, and we hope that you continue to join us on the first Wednesday of each month. Have a great week.